Okay, that's what we ended with. Very good, yeah. Kennedy's making preparations for his Monday night speech, okay? And he tells the Joint Chiefs what his intentions are. He's going to inform the American people about the crisis in Cuba for the first time, so it's not a secret anymore. And he orders General Maxwell Taylor to put the United States Armed Forces on DEFCON 3. Okay? He did meet, remember, with Walter Sweeney that day, talk about the possibility of airstrikes. And he asked General Sweeney, can you promise to get all the missiles if we airstrike? And he said, we can get all the missiles we know about. And then General LeMay kind of stepped in and said, we can assure 90% of the missiles and missile bases would be taken out. And so Kennedy said he would make his decision and announce on Monday. Remember, he had Theodore Sorensen write a speech with both scenarios. Okay? So let's talk about the Cuban Missile Crisis, 13 days in October 1962, Part 2. And we're on to Monday, October 22nd. Well, that morning, I thought this was kind of interesting, that morning, President Kennedy telephoned former Presidents Herbert Hoover, Harry Truman, and Dwight Eisenhower and explained to them, prior to his Monday night speech, what was going on in Cuba and asking for some of their advice. So those former presidents, Hoover, Truman, and Eisenhower, were called by President Kennedy the morning of Monday, October 22nd. He briefed them on the situation in Cuba and asked them for some personal advice prior to his scheduled television interview on Monday night. After that, the president then wrote a correspondence to Soviet Premier Khrushchev. He wrote a correspondence to Soviet Premier Khrushchev. And this is what it stated. You don't have to write this down. Just listen. In the correspondence, Kennedy said to Khrushchev, quote, I have not assumed that you or any other sane man would in this nuclear age deliberately plunge the world into war which it is crystal clear no country could win and which could only result in catastrophic consequences to the whole world. So he sent this correspondence basically saying, I can't really believe that you're going to put missiles in Cuba and put us in a situation where we could go to war, a war in which no country could win because of the nuclear age we're in. He sends that correspondence to Khrushchev. Then Press Secretary Pierre Salinger gives a formal announcement to the country that the president's going to address the nation tonight on a subject of the highest national security. Here's an original paper that came out when that came out. This is kind of a hard thing to find. This is the Goldsboro News, which is in Goldsboro, North Carolina. It's dated Monday, October 22nd, 1962. And the headline says, Kennedy will address nation tonight on subject of highest national urgency. This is an original newspaper as a result of Pierre Salinger announcing that. And what Pierre Salinger announces to the press, he says, quote, President Kennedy will address the nation tonight on radio and television on a matter of highest national urgency. So basically they told the American people, tune in, because tonight you're going to hear the president talk about an issue of high interest or urgency. Now, prior to his speech that evening, and you're going to need to know this, President Kennedy made the following preparations. He did these four things prior to his speech. Number one, he ordered the Navy to begin preparations for the blockade of Cuba. He ordered the Navy to begin preparations for the blockade of Cuba. He ordered the Navy to begin preparations for the blockade of Cuba. The second thing he did, realistically, is he basically just drew a line in the sand on how far he would let those Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before action would be taken. Now, what was the original estimate? They would confront them 800 miles. He's actually moved that much closer to Cuba. But he actually did draw a line in the sand, so to speak, or a line in the ocean on how far he's going to let the Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before action's going to be taken. Okay, he picked the spot. Okay, He also, number 3, informed military personnel that if those merchant ships crossed this point or ran the blockade and they entered American waters, that ships would be attacked. Okay, so another thing he did prior to his speech that evening is he informed military personnel that if the merchant ships crossed that line in the sand and they entered American waters, the merchant ships would be attacked. Okay? And the 4th thing he stated, he made it really clear that if the quarantine line was ignored, war would be declared by the United States onto the Soviet Union. So this was no screwing around. If those ships did not stop at the quarantine line and they crossed and we had to attack those ships, we would declare war upon the Soviet Union. That's how serious that quarantine line was. So again, number 1, he ordered the Navy to begin preparations for the blockade of Cuba. Number 2, he actually drew a line in the sand, so to speak, on how far he would let Soviet ships advance towards Cuba before action would be taken. Number 3, he informed military personnel that if merchant ships crossed that point in the sand, so to speak, and they entered American waters, they would be attacked. And if they crossed that line, he made it very clear that the United States would declare war on the Soviet Union. We were at a very tense time in American history. What time is he going to give his speech? 7 o'clock. At 5 o'clock, he briefs Congress for the first time on his decision to enact a quarantine of Cuba. At 5 o'clock, he meets with Congress and he briefs Congress on the contents of his speech and his decision to enact a quarantine of Cuba. And why is he doing that? He's meeting with not all of Congress, I should rephrase that, the big leaders of Congress. Why is he meeting with the leaders of Congress at 5 o'clock? They find out from him, and what's he want from them? Support. Maybe some opinion, but he wants their support. Well, he leaves that meeting very angry and frustrated because it turned out he had very little support from Congress to put a quarantine in effect. So he left that meeting very, very, very frustrated because Congress did not support, not much of Congress supported his idea. Now, he was mad. And what's he going to do here pretty quick? He's going to give a speech. So who's the guy that's going to have to settle him down? What? No? Kenneth O'Donnell. As soon as he sees that the president is very frustrated and angry, he asks the president for a word before he left for his national address. Okay, he doesn't want the president to go. You ever I've done this so many times in my life. I do it more than I should. I've learned a lot when I was young. But I gave a lot of great speeches I live to regret because you're angry. You say or do something. Does he want him to go on national television and tell the people of America about this while he's angry and frustrated? No. He wants to take a little time. He wants a word. Well, President Kennedy was very angry. He tried to explain to O'Donnell I don't have time. I don't have time. I got to get ready. I don't have time. And finally O'Donnell looked at him and said, hey, you're the President of the United States. They will wait for you. In other words, you're on their timeline. Okay? That's what he said, and I think that's a great, great quote. He finally got him settled down by saying, you got time. You're the President of the United States. They will wait for you. So O'Donnell proceeded to set the President down, settle him down prior to his speech. Well, at 6 p.m., as Kenneth O'Donnell is settling down the President, Secretary of State Dean Rusk is notifying Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin, this guy's going to be a big player in this before it's over, who's the Soviet ambassador to the United States, about what President Kennedy is going to tell the American people. So they actually informed the Soviets by virtue of telling Anatoly Dobrynin, the Soviet ambassador to the United States, what President Kennedy's speech is going to be about. So the Russians actually have an hour notice before the American people will hear. So at 6 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Secretary of State Dean Rusk formally notifies Russian Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin of the contents of the President's speech. Now, when we were watching the movie, you remember President Kennedy talked to Gromyko, and he was a dark-haired guy, and the guy next to him was kind of a light-haired guy and had glasses? That was Dobrynin, because he actually was in with the talk with Kennedy and Gromyko, but we didn't really acknowledge that at the time. But he's the big guy. He is the Russian ambassador to the United States. He's the most powerful diplomat in America at the time, and Secretary of State Dean Rusk tells Anatoly Dobrynin what the president's going to do. Well, at 7 p.m., President Kennedy addresses the nation concerning the crisis in Cuba. At 7 p.m., he addresses the people of the United States of America on national television and radio concerning the crisis in Cuba. It was probably a 20-minute speech or so, but these are the 5 main things that he told the American people that night. And if you want to watch the speech in its entirety, if you go to the website and go under AP US History Historical Videos, you can watch it. And you'll see part of it when we watch 13 days. But if you want to see the whole thing, I put it there for your convenience. But these are basically the 5 things he told the American people about in order. Okay, number 1, he told them about the missile construction sites in Cuba. He told them about the missile construction sites in Cuba. Number 1. He informed them of the missile construction sites in Cuba. Number 2, he told the American people there were already missiles in Cuba. He told them there were already missiles on the ground in Cuba. The third thing he told the American people was that the Soviet Union was denying that there were any missiles or missile construction sites in Cuba. He told the American people that the Russians were denying that there were any missiles or missile construction sites in Cuba. Obviously, number 4, he told them about his decision to enact a naval blockade. He called it a quarantine, but it is a blockade. He tells the American people about the quarantine of all ships into Cuba. And then he expresses the seriousness of his actions if Cuba would make the decision to launch any of those missiles against the United States. So he tells them about the missile construction sites in Cuba, the fact there were already missiles in Cuba, the fact that the Soviet Union was denying that there were any missiles or construction sites in Cuba, his decision to enact the blockade or quarantine of Cuba, and how serious his actions would be if Cuba made a decision to launch any of those missiles at the United States. What do you think that decision is going to be? What's the seriousness of his actions if they do that? Yes, and this is what he said. Don't write it down, but you'll hear it in the video. He said, "It shall be the policy of this nation to regard any nuclear missile launched from Cuba against any nation in the Western Hemisphere as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response upon the Soviet Union." What he's saying is if any missiles are launched from Cuba to anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, not just the United States, that the United States will declare war and retaliate against those missile sites. So he scared the hell out of a lot of people, because you've got to remember they had no idea what was going on at this time. That's what happened on Monday, October 22nd, 1962. So now all the American people know of the situation in Cuba. Okay, let's move to Tuesday, October 23rd. This is an interesting day. Well, what do you think they do right in the morning on Tuesday, October 23rd? XCOM meets and gets ready to set this quarantine in place. Now, if you're the president, what's your greatest concern? What is the Navy going to do if these Soviet ships refuse our ultimatum, not stopping at the quarantine line? If they just blow by it? But what are we really going to do? That's what he wants to know. He's made a good talk about, we're going to attack him and all that, but his point is, what are you going to do? How are we going to go about this? What's going to be the story? So Bobby Kennedy steps in and he asked Admiral George Anderson to clarify the rules of engagement if Soviet ships do not stop at the quarantine line. Because the president wants to know what the Navy's going to do. You know, we can say, well, we're going to attack them. Well, how are you going to do that? What's going to happen here? Okay? What are the rules of engagement if they refuse to stop at the quarantine line? Well, Admiral Anderson then briefed the entire ExComm committee on what the official rules of engagement will be, which were a four-step process. Four-step process. Step 1. The Navy would attempt to make radio contact with the approaching ships using sailors fluent in Russian. Now we're talking about, we're going back to square one, because what's Kennedy get briefed on? Just what they do if they cross the quarantine line. Not only that, but how are you going to deal with these? Here they come. How are you going to get them to stop? How are you going to let them know they can't go past the line in the sand? So here's the rules of engagement. First of all, as these ships approach, the Navy's going to attempt to make radio contact with the ship using American sailors that are fluent in Russian. Once they get a hold of those ships and can communicate with them, step 2 would be Soviet ships would be ordered to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. Reduce speed and stand by for inspection. The third rule of engagement, once the ships approach the quarantine line, is once the ship reduced speed and stood by for inspection, the naval inspection team would board and search the Soviet vessel. What are they looking for? Missiles. And step 4 would be, if the vessel contained offensive weapons or missiles, what would happen then? We already talked about this before. What's that? They would tell them to turn around and go home with the missiles. Now, if they stopped the ship and they had no missiles on them, what would be the step? They'd let them go. So, these ships are heading towards the quarantine line. Once they get close, step 1, the Navy's going to attempt to make radio contact with approaching Soviet ships using American sailors fluent in Russian. Step 2, once they get in contact with them, they're going to order those Soviet ships to reduce speed and stand by for inspection. When they reduce speed and stand by for inspection, step 3, the Navy inspection team would board and search the vessel. Once they search the vessel, they then would determine whether they carried offensive weapons or not. If they didn't, they'd let them go on their way. If they did, they would ask them to turn around with the weapons still in their possession and go back to Russia. Well, Admiral Anderson explains that, and Bobby then asked Admiral Anderson, well, what course of action is going to be taken if the Soviet ships refuse to be searched? In other words, they stop, but they refuse to let you on the ship to search. What are we going to do then? Admiral Anderson's response to Bobby was that if the Russian ships refused to be searched, they simply would be towed into the nearest port. The American military would tow them in to the nearest port. What would be Bobby's next question? What would be our course of action if they simply run the blockade? They don't listen to us, they don't slow down or stop, they just keep on a-going. And Admiral Anderson gave a 2-step process for that. Okay? So if they simply run the blockade, the first step would be the Navy would fire a warning shot across the bow of the Soviet ship. This is if they ran the blockade. They would shoot a warning shot across the bow of the ship. Now, Bobby's next question was, what's going to happen if they ignore the warning shot and keep going? And Admiral Anderson said, we would then shoot out their rudder, disabling the vehicle, board and inspect. Okay? So the next question is, well, what if they don't take heed to our warning shot? And Admiral Anderson said, then we will fire at the ship's rudder, we'll disable the ship and carry on with the inspection. At that time, President Kennedy got nervous and he stepped into the conversation and he made it very clear to the military, there would not be any firing on any Soviet ships without what? His explicit permission. He'll be the only one that says whether we're firing Soviet ships. Because he believes if we fire on Soviet ships, even to disable the rudder, that they will see that as an attack. Okay? So, there's kind of the scenario of the whole thing of what's going to happen. Now, the next topic of discussion in XCOM is they talked about the need for further spy flights over Cuba. Now, what do they want to have pictures for now? Let me preface this by saying, these flights are going to be different than the ones we've talked about. These are going to be low-level flights on the deck. Not way up here taking pictures, I mean on the deck. Because what do they want to see? What do they want to get photographs of? Progress, and especially the launching pads to see how close they are to becoming operational. So these low-level flights are going to be different than these flights we had up here. These are going to be on the deck, okay? Now these low-level flights would be needed to get the best photographs of the missiles and missile launching pads on the island of Cuba. They're going to be very risky because what's going to happen as soon as these Cubans and Soviets see American planes on the deck? They're going to shoot at them because they don't know if they're taking pictures or they're coming in. So these are risky. Okay, these are risky flights. Now, what's the military going to want to do if those pilots are shot at? They're going to want to retaliate. So that pushes us closer to what scenario? Airstrike.